Next up, we're going to talk about fund sources and uses. So let me bring that up. Okay. We get a lot of questions about different types of funds. Where does the money come from? What can I use this fund for? What can I use this other fund for? So we wanted to take a look at some common statutory funds that we get questions about and show you how they're funded and give you some information on what they can be used for. We hope this will help answer some of the questions that we get. Sometimes we'll get asked a question about a fund that's really a home rule fund. It's one you've created locally. And what that fund can be used for should be documented in the ordinance, in the home rule ordinance that created that fund. So a lot of times we'll just refer you back to your ordinance that created it and see if it, hopefully it has included what the fund was be used for. Whenever you're creating a home rule fund, the ordinance should have what the source of revenue is going to be and what the fund can be used for. But today we're going to concentrate on the ones you see on your screen: the motor vehicle highway, local road and street, cumulative capital improvement, the rainy day fund, the riverboat fund, and then public safety. The MVH Fund is authorized in Indiana Code 8-14-1, and it can be used for construction and maintenance of your roads, streets, and alleys, and that authority is in Indiana Code 8-14-1-5. So we're talking things like repairing a roadway, oiling or sprinkling, your winter operations, your laying down of salt, your snow plowing, weed control along roadways that can come out of MVH, tree trimming for road safety. So if you've got a tree that has a big overhang over a street and there's concern that if the tree were to fall, it could be a car or a person down there, you can trim trees for road safety purposes, and just general road cleaning. The uses of your MVH fund include curb work related to railroad crossings, the purchase of highway equipment, traffic signs and signals, the costs related to safety zones and safety zone devices, painting, structures, objects, road surfaces like line striping, turn lane arrows, crosswalks. And we don't take on an exception if you use your MVH for sideway or for sidewalks that are adjacent to city or town streets. If you had a sidewalk or a path or a trail that went not adjacent to a street and it went through your park, something like that, that would not be something you could use MVH for. Indiana Code 8-14-1-5C was a new addition to the statute in 2018, and it requires cities and towns to use at least 50% of their MVH allocations for construction, reconstruction, and preservation. For transparency and accountability purposes on those restrictions and that restricted money, the state examiner issued directive number 2018-2, which instructed cities and towns to create a subfund on their ledger and to number that subfund number 203. Now, subfund means it's technically still part of MVH, but it's got to be accounted for on your ledgers and reported in the annual financial report separately from other MVH monies. If you want to read the directive, you can go to this link and look for the subject heading Directive 2018-2. And of course, Susan showed you earlier how you can go to our website, just our homepage, and over on the left, go down to political subdivisions, click on cities or towns. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Our website, over on the left-hand side, go to About Us. It's right above political subdivision. Click on the About Us, and one of the drop-downs is State Examiner Directives. So your MVH Restricted Fund, we get this question quite a bit, does not include any tax levy money. So some of you out there have a levy on your MVH fund, where you get taxes coming in twice a year from your county auditor. Those do not have to be split and half of them be put in your MVH Restricted. We're only talking about those monthly distributions you get from the state. Your direct deposit comes from the auditor state's office each month. Those are the amounts that you have to put at least 50% in MVH Restricted. And when it said, I apologize, when the statute says at least 50%, that means you can put more in your MVH Restricted if your town wants to, but your council needs to adopt an ordinance stating how much more than that 50%. Don't know that I've heard of too many that are putting more than 50% in. I think I do remember one place that was putting 60% in. So just, if you're going to put more than the 50%, your council needs to take action. And the money in the MVH Restricted Fund can be used for construction, reconstruction, and preservation of your roads. Now, there are some definitions of what construction, reconstruction, and preservation activities are on our website. If you want to see that, it's probably easier to shoot me an email, and I can give you the link or show you how to get there. It's probably a little easier than trying to do it here. So go ahead and send an email to cities.towns if you want to see where those definitions are. Now we'll move to local road and streets. The Local Road and Street Fund, created under 8-14-2, and is used to account for the state gasoline and special use tax distributions. It can be used for the items in 8-14-2-5. Basically, are building roads, paying principal and interest for road debts, the local cost for a recreational or reservoir road project, if you happen to have one of those in your community, and it can be used for equipment that's related to highway. Our longstanding audit position is that the fund is to be used for direct expenses incurred in the construction, reconstruction, or maintenance of arterial and local roads and streets. So this would kind of prohibit local roads and streets from being used for constructing buildings, for example, or for such indirect costs such as administrative salaries or supplies or goods or administrative goods or materials that aren't directly used for the building of the roads or the paying of the principal or those other costs that we described. Cumulative Capital Improvement Fund is authorized under Indiana Code 6-7-1, and its primary purpose is to account for the state cigarette tax distributions. 6-7-1-31.1A requires each city and town establish by ordinance a CCI fund. So it should already have one of these, and it should have been at some point in the past created by an ordinance. What the fund can be used for are listed in the statute, and there are 9 different ones listed. Probably the one that gives you the most flexibility is the 9th one, which was added a few years ago, and it states that CCI can be used for any governmental purpose for which money is appropriated by council. So if council appropriates money for supplies, you can use CCI for supply. They appropriate money for salaries, you can use CCI for salary. Just anything that could have been appropriated somewhere else or is appropriated somewhere else, you can use CCI for. And the one good thing about CCI is in subsection C, it permits a transfer at any time and by ordinance or resolution of CCI monies to the general fund. And then from the general fund, you could use it for general fund purposes, any lawful city or town item. Just remember, it doesn't have to be an ordinance because the statute says ordinance or resolution, but it would be something the council would have to do in order to transfer money out of CCI to the general fund. Next is the rainy day fund. It's authorized under Indiana Code 36-1-8-5 and 36-1-8-5.1. Its primary purpose is to account for transfers of unused and unencumbered funds. The amount of the transfer is not to be more than 10% of the city or town's total annual budget adopted under 6-1.1-17 for that fiscal year. And we get a lot of questions on what rainy day can be used for. We get a call and say, hey, they want to do this or that. Could we use rainy day money for it? And the answer is it's going to depend. Excuse me. It's going to depend on what your ordinance that created your rainy day fund says it can be used for. If your ordinance doesn't have specifics, or if what you're considering using for is a little unclear, maybe it's a gray area in the ordinance, you could always update or amend the ordinance. But if during an audit we're looking at what you spent your rainy day money on, we're going to refer back to the ordinance that created the rainy day fund to see if you spent that money in compliance with the ordinance. Some of these others that we've talked about before, these other funds, they have statutory uses, very specific in them. The rainy day fund does it. It allows you to create the fund and it says you can move money into it, but it doesn't go into what specifically you can use it for. So that's where we rely on the ordinance to say what your entity wants to use rainy day money for. Next is the Riverboat. The Riverboat money is authorized under Indiana Code 36-1-8-9 to account for a couple of different admission and wagering taxes. It can be used for any legal purpose of a city or town. And I wanted to point out that there isn't any authority to transfer it to any other funds. We get that question a lot. Can we move Riverboat to this fund or that fund? No, I think we take audit exception to that because there's a lack of authority to transfer it. However, because it can be used for any legal purpose, you can just disperse it out of the Riverboat fund. There's really no need to transfer it anywhere else. So if you've got a claim that you want to pay part out of park, or you've got a park expense, and rather than posting the whole invoice to the park fund, if you want to pay for part of it out of Riverboat, you can pay a portion out of park and a portion out of Riverboat on that one check that you've written. And that way you wouldn't have to move the money anywhere or transfer it around. Next up is the Local Law Enforcement Continuing Education Fund. It's authorized under Indiana Code 5-2-8-2. It's used to account for fees from local law enforcement continuing education fees, motor vehicle inspection fees, accident reports, gun permits, and any proceeds from the sale of confiscated weapons. Those all go into your law enforcement continuing ed fund. And it can be used for, if you look at Indiana Code 5-2-8-6, training police officers or law enforcement personnel, and to purchase law enforcement equipment and supplies. So that can mean weapons for police officers, ammunition, a new vehicle, new radar gun, anything that would go for law enforcement or police purposes could be paid for out of local law enforcement fund. The last fund I wanted to talk about is the Public Safety Fund. It's authorized under several sections in Indiana Code 6-3.6. It's used to account for the additional tax rate imposed by your county, if your county has one, for public safety. We get a lot of questions about what can we use this money for. And our position is in Indiana Code 6-3.6-2-14, there are a total of 14 different things that are defined as public safety. I've shown the first 5 on the slide and the last 2 because they're the ones I think are most likely to impact most cities and towns. Generally, it's anything for a police or a fire system. So it can be salaries, it can be equipment. If you have emergency ambulance services, your public safety lit can be used for that. And in number 13 and 14, those I think were the 2 most recent additions. In 13, it can be used for pension payments for police and fire. And it can also be used for law enforcement training. So we just talked about local law enforcement continuing ed fund. And now public safety lit can be used for law enforcement training. But you want to be sure to check out the whole list. If you've got questions on what you want to use it for, because like I said, there are 14. I didn't show all 14. Some of the other ones involve jails or courts that some of you might have. So you want to take a look at that statute if you've got questions. And I do want to point out that our position is that the public safety lit should go in a separate fund. Now, before IC 6-3.6 went into effect, there was public safety was referred to and authorized under 6-3.5, and in those old statutes, it did talk about the money gets deposited in a separate fund. Well, then 6-3.5 got repealed a few years ago, and 6.3.6 went into effect, and that same language wasn't included. But our position is, since you were accounting for that in a separate fund prior to, you should continue to account for it in a separate fund going forward. And if I didn't say, that fund number should be 249. So in conclusion, if you ever have questions, you can always look in the Cities and Towns Manual in Chapter 4. These funds are described there, as well as some other information. I think you'll find it very useful. Susan showed you how to get there earlier, but again, it's in.gov/SBOA, our homepage. And over on the left, political subdivisions, go to either city or town, depending on which you are. Look for the section called Manuals, and click on the drop down there. You'll see the court manual and a couple of other manuals like the regulatory manual. And then you'll see the Cities and Towns Manual. When you click on that drop down, it'll show you each fund listed separately, and when you click on that, there's a link that takes you to that. So look for the Chapter 4, just click on the link, and it'll take you to definitions and uses and accounting for these funds.
We did have a question. On the MVH Fund, in 2019, we had the MVH Restricted Fund came in. So what if a clerk treasurer discovers now that that was not set up in 2019, but they've set it up now? Do they have to go back to 2019 to fund that?
I don't think we would take audit exception if you did, but I don't think you would have to. I think what we ought to do is start going forward, create it for 2020, and then you can go back. Let's say you just created it today. You would have to go back, I think, to January and February and March, all the previous months of this year, and take 50% of your distributions and put it in the Fund 203 that you're just now creating. But I don't know that you need to go back into the previous year, because some of that money was already spent in the previous year, and it'd be hard to identify. I mean, you could come up with your 50%, but you wouldn't know how much of that got spent. So I would say just do it for 2020 and go forward. If we take audit exception to it, that it didn't get created when it was supposed to in the previous year, that would be on your predecessor, and the comment in the report would note that in 2019 MVH Restricted wasn't established as required, and it would indicate, it would be clear that it was not you that did something wrong, it was the previous person.